December 31st, 1939. The icy skies over Finland crackled with tension as Finnish pilot Ilmari Juutilainen's Fokker D.XXI sliced through the air. His plane was a relic, slow, underpowered, and built of wood and steel tubing. They hadn't bothered to build more than a couple hundred of them. Ahead of him, a Soviet Polikarpov I-16 loomed, faster, more agile, and heavily armed. On paper, the Soviet pilot had every advantage. As Juutilainen moved into position behind the I-16, the Soviet pilot suddenly pulled into a sharp left turn, trying to use the I-16's superior speed to circle around and catch Juutilainen from behind. But Juutilainen was no ordinary pilot. In a split-second decision, he pulled his Fokker sharply into the cloud cover and swiftly yanked the plane to the right. It didn't matter what Juutilainen had to fly. He was a born killer, as the Soviets were about to discover. Ilmari Juutilainen's story begins in the quiet town of D.XXI, born on February 21st, 1914. Growing up by the Lautoka Sea, young Juutilainen found inspiration in the Ilmari base near his hometown. His love for the skies grew through his sailing days with the Volunteer Maritime Defense Association, developing the discipline and courage that would later define his career. In 1932, Juutilainen began his national service as an assistant mechanic, but his eyes were always on the skies. Earning his pilot's license through a civilian course, he joined the Finnish Air Force and underwent rigorous training at the Air Force Academy at Kauhava from 1935 to 36. His first posting in 1937 was at LELB-12 near Viipuri, before moving to Uti Air Base in 1938 to train in fighter tactics. By 1939, the storm of war was on the horizon. On March 3rd, Juutilainen was transferred to LELB-24, flying Fokker D-21s in preparation for what was to come. In October, his squadron moved to Imola, closer to the Soviet frontier. The Winter War was about to begin. The sky over Finland rumbled with the distant hum of enemy bombers on December 19, 1939. With Finnish ice in his veins, Juutilainen sat in the cockpit of his Fokker D-21, scanning the horizon. The Winter War pitted the Finnish Air Force against an overwhelming Soviet army. Superior in numbers and technology, the Soviets boasted faster aircraft, more heavily armed bombers, and seemingly indestructible tanks. Juutilainen's Fokker was slower than the Soviet Polikarpov I-16, lacking the agility and armor of his opponents. Yet, it had one critical edge: its pilot. A crackle over the radio interrupted his thoughts. 3 Soviet Ilyushin DB-3 bombers were approaching. Juutilainen's eyes narrowed as he instinctively banked his Fokker and pushed the throttle forward, racing toward the enemy. His heart thudded in rhythm with the rumbling engine, adrenaline flooding his veins. He climbed to 1,500 feet, placing himself above the incoming bombers. The Soviets were oblivious to the danger that lurked in the cold northern skies. With sweaty palms and singular focus, Juutilainen gripped the control stick tighter. The DB-3s were directly below him now, their bellies heavy with bombs intended to rain destruction on Finnish soil. He dove. The Soviet bombers, realizing they were being hunted, dropped their payloads into the forests below and turned to flee. But Juutilainen was relentless. His Fokker, though slower, had the advantage of altitude and a steady shooting platform. He lined up the first bomber, squeezing the trigger. The twin machine guns roared to life, the tracers lighting up the dark sky as they tore into the rear gunner's position. One gunner down. He shifted his aim to the engines, the Fokker's gun spitting out round after round. The bomber shuddered under the impact, its engine sputtering smoke. As the first bomber began to nosedive, flames licking its tail, Juutilainen switched targets. The other 2 bombers were already in a shallow descent, smoke billowing from their fuselages. He stayed on them, hammering their engines until his ammunition ran dry. Satisfied with the chaos he had unleashed, he peeled away and turned for home. The enemy had been neutralized, for now. On New Year's Eve, 1939, Juutilainen was hunting again, but this time it was a duel between fighters. Man against man, machine against machine. The Soviet pilot, flying the nimble Polikarpov I-16, was no easy prey. They circled each other like wolves, both aircraft losing speed as they spiraled through the cold sky at low altitude. The Soviet fighter was faster, more agile. Juutilainen knew that the Polikarpov was inching its way into position behind him, ready to strike. But he was not one to panic. At the last second, Juutilainen yanked his Fokker into the low cloud cover. He disappeared into the mist, the Soviet pilot losing sight of him. But Juutilainen was already planning his counterattack. Inside the cloud, he reversed his turn, bursting out on the other side. His eyes locked onto the Soviet fighter just ahead. This was his moment. He lined up the I-16 in his gun sight, the distance between them closing rapidly. 100 yards, 80 yards, 50 yards. He fired. The burst hit its mark, tearing into the Soviet fighter's engine. Smoke poured from the Polikarpov as it shuddered, its pilot losing control. The Soviet aircraft nosed over and plummeted into the Finnish forest below. With the enemy vanquished, Juutilainen flew home once more, his heart still pounding with the thrill of victory. By the end of the Winter War, Ilmari Juutilainen had achieved 3 confirmed victories. 1 shared victory and 2 more on his own. But the Soviets were not ready to give up. In April 1940, springtime had arrived, and so had new aircraft for the Finnish Air Force, the Brewster B-239, aka the Buffalo. Juutilainen felt the surge of power beneath him as he climbed into the cockpit of the Brewster Buffalo for the first time. The sleek aircraft was about to radically alter the balance between favorite and underdog. Agile, well-armed, with 3 12.7mm and 1 7.62mm machine guns and armored around the pilot's seat, the Buffalo had a reputation as a hunter in the skies. With over 4 hours of endurance, it was ready to take the fight to the Soviets. July 21st, 1941. The battlefield above Kekkisalmi erupted into carnage. Soviet fighters from the 65th SHAP dove in, strafing Finnish positions below. Juutilainen and 5 other Finnish pilots were scrambled in their Buffaloes, engines bursting with energy, as they clawed their way into the sky. As they approached the battlefield, Juutilainen's senses grew razor-sharp, scanning the skies for prey. Then he spotted it, a Polikarpov I-153 Chaika, darting through the sky like a shark among minnows. With a sudden thrust of the throttle, he positioned himself behind the Chaika. His finger hovered over the trigger for just a moment, then he squeezed it. The Buffalo's machine guns flashed, tracers slicing through the air and into the Soviet fighter. The Chaika tried to break away, but it was too late. Juutilainen's rounds ripped through its fuselage, and with a final burst, the enemy plane exploded in flames, spiraling down to the earth. Another victory for Finland, and a star fighter ace was born. On the crisp morning of February 6, 1942, the sky over the Petrovsky Yam region churned with danger. Juutilainen, alongside his fellow LLV-24 pilots, soared through the clouds, eyes sharp as steel. Suddenly, out of the icy blue horizon, 7 Soviet Tupolev SB bombers appeared, flanked by an escort of 12 MiG-3 fighters. Recalling the action of that day, Juutilainen said, quote, "I noticed the bombers at 3,000 meters and radioed the boys about them. As we intercepted the Soviet aircraft, I spotted a formation of 3 SBs heading for a nearby railway line and dived after them. Targeting the aircraft to the left of the formation, my fire set its port wing aflame." The odds were staggering, but Juutilainen's pulse quickened with the thrill of the hunt. With unwavering focus, he dove into the fray, his gun screaming to anger, quote, "The SB crashed next to the railway line. Just as I started after the lead bomber, I observed a MiG fighter closing in on me. In spite of the threat posed by the latter, I managed to hit the bomber in the starboard engine, which poured out smoke and oil. Moments later, the airplane rolled over to the right and plunged into the forest close to the railway line. Turning my attention to the MiG, which was above me, I managed to shoot at it as we raced towards each other. In a blaze of precision and skill, 2 of the Soviet bombers crumbled under his fire, sent spiraling towards the earth. Quote, "My aim was good, and the fighter started to trail black smoke from the engine. He banked away to the east, losing altitude as it went." By March 27, 1942, war had shifted to the Gulf of Finland. The Finnish army was preparing for an offensive on Sursari, and Juutilainen's squadron, 3rd LLV-24, was stationed at Imola, ready to provide air cover. The situation was grim. They were outnumbered by Soviet forces, but these pilots had the experience the Soviets lacked. As for guts, Juutilainen had plenty to spare. On March 28th, Juutilainen and a fellow sergeant were patrolling near the Surkila shoreline when they spotted them, a formation of Soviet I-153 Chaikas from the 11th IAP. The enemy was right where they wanted them. Without hesitation, Juutilainen dived into the attack, the Brewster screaming as it cut through the air. He locked onto one of the Chaikas and let his machine guns loose, the roar of bullets deafening in the tight cockpit. A burst of smoke erupted from the Soviet plane as Juutilainen's rounds found their mark. The Chaika lurched, its engine spewing flames, before crashing into the sea below. Another Soviet fighter met the same fate, Juutilainen's accuracy claiming its second victim of the day. September 20th, 1942. Juutilainen soared once again, this time alongside Captain Jorma Karhunen and the rest of 3rd LLV-24. Their mission, a patrol near the Estonian coast. As they approached their target, 10 Soviet fighters ambushed them. The sky exploded in chaos. But Juutilainen was ready. His Brewster rolled and banked sharply, dodging enemy fire. He lined up his sights on a Soviet fighter, the air thick with tension. He fired. His tracers slashed through the enemy, sending the fighter plummeting into the Gulf. Another Soviet plane followed, falling victim to Juutilainen's ruthless precision. By the end of the dogfight, 3 Soviet fighters were down, 2 of them Juutilainen's. Against overwhelming odds, he had once again turned the tide of battle, proving that in the skies, Ilmari Juutilainen was untouchable in his Buffalo. The question was how lethal he could become in an even better aircraft. February 1943. The Finnish skies were darker now, filled with the thunderous growl of newer, faster Soviet aircraft. But Juutilainen was ready for them. His squadron had just received the sleek, lethal Messerschmitt Bf-109 G2s from Germany. The timing couldn't have been better. The aging Brewster Buffaloes had served them well, but the Soviets were flying better planes now, and Finland needed to match them. The Bf-109 was a powerful machine, a predator in the sky. With its superior speed, firepower, and agility, it was the perfect tool for a pilot like Juutilainen. He quickly adapted, and soon the Soviet pilots would feel the full fury of the Finnish ace. In his Messerschmitt, Juutilainen was unstoppable. He racked up victory after victory, adding 58 more enemy aircraft to his tally. On June 30th, 1944, he made history by shooting down 6 Soviet planes in a single day. Each victory was confirmed by Soviet loss records, cementing his status as one of the most lethal pilots in the war. It was a feat that made him an ace in a day, an achievement few could claim. The war was nearing its end, but Juutilainen showed no signs of slowing down. Every sortie was a battle of wits and skill, and every Soviet plane that crossed his path became another mark on his growing list of victories. His relentless pursuit of the enemy and unmatched precision made him the most feared pilot in the Finnish Air Force. September 3rd, 1944, Juutilainen soared above the Karelian Isthmus in his Messerschmitt, hunting once again. Suddenly, a Soviet Li-2 appeared, a military transport plane, the Russian version of the Douglas C-47. Juutilainen moved into position, his eyes focused on the target. With a burst of gunfire, the Li-2 was obliterated. It was his 94th victory, his final triumph. By the end of the war in 1944, Ilmari Juutilainen had cemented his place as Finland's highest-scoring non-German ace and a legend in aerial combat. He earned 94 confirmed air-to-air victories, with 36 achieved in his beloved Brewster Buffalo. Juutilainen was one of only 4 double recipients of the Mannerheim Cross Second Class, making him a double knight, a rare honor for his unparalleled bravery. It wasn't just victories that defined him. When offered an officer's commission, he chose to remain in the cockpit, defending Finland with every mission. Regarding the fighting spirit of his homeland, Juutilainen proudly proclaims that, quote, "If you threaten Finns, they do not become frightened. They become angry, and they never surrender."